Interestingly, the natural order of grammar acquisition is quite different from what people expect. The grammar that we often think is simple is sometimes acquired much later than other grammar points. For example, in English, we add an S to the end of verbs in the third person singular of the present tense. For example, we say, I walk, but he walks. This is quite a strange rule because verbs don't change like this otherwise in English. And research shows that in first language acquisition and second language acquisition, this grammar point is acquired very late on. However, most teachers of English think this is a simple rule, so they spend lots of time teaching it and correcting students' mistakes at an early level. This wastes time and makes students feel bad for not understanding something simple, when actually it's one of the last things native speakers acquire as well. If you think of language as a list of rules, then it makes sense to teach this way, but if you believe that language is abstract, then this doesn't make sense. Since Krashen's original theory, research has shown that this idea is true and that actually there is a natural order for many parts of language. This is sometimes called ordered development. The order can change a bit depending on your native language, but it mostly stays the same. Finally, Stephen Krashen's fifth hypothesis is the affective filter hypothesis. Affective with an A means related to feelings or emotions. A filter is something that you use to keep some things out, but take some things in. For example, you might use an air filter to keep some things in the air, like oxygen. Oxygen is very important for us to live, but to take out things like dead skin and pollen, which make the quality of the air worse. The affective filter hypothesis states that when a learner has negative emotions, bad feelings, like anxiety, nervousness, or boredom, the negative emotions create a filter which makes acquiring language harder. If you're having fun while learning English and you feel relaxed, you're going to understand a lot more of the language. But if you're bored, hungry, or scared that you'll say something wrong, you'll understand less language. Those negative emotions create a filter that stops the language from coming in. Therefore, it is very important for language classes and language resources to create positive feelings. Correcting students for making mistakes, in my experience, mainly creates negative emotions. And over time, students can build up a strong affective filter. I've had students who are so nervous that as soon as they don't understand one word, they panic, they get anxious, and then they cannot understand anything. So, these are the 5 hypotheses that make up Stephen Krashen's theory of comprehensible input. I'll just remind you of what they are, then we'll take a break. And when we come back, I'll explain how I use them to make English spoken stories. The 5 hypotheses are: 1. The input hypothesis. That we acquire language best when it is just a bit above our current level, or I+1. 2. The acquisition learning hypothesis. That subconsciously acquired language and consciously learned language are separate, and improvement comes only from acquisition. 3. The monitor hypothesis. That consciously learned language can only be used to monitor our output, our speaking and writing, and not to actually speak and write. 4. The natural order hypothesis. That all learners acquire language in a certain order. 5. And the effective filter hypothesis, that negative emotions can create a filter which makes acquiring language harder. That was a lot, huh? Your brain must be hurting now. So let's take another break. You could even go and sleep for a bit, or come back to this episode another day. Don't worry, I'll still be here. Break. In the past, when I taught English to groups, the issue always was, how do I make myself comprehensible to all these people? It's the same question I had when I started English spoken stories. I already knew how to make my classes and my podcast fun. With stories, of course. This isn't an original idea of mine. There is a language teaching method called TPRS, Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling, which uses storytelling and theater to teach languages. But when you teach in a real-life classroom, there are many ways to make yourself comprehensible. You can draw pictures, make gestures with your hands, and translate individual words. Plus, students can tell you when they don't understand, and then you can explain. Often, students come from similar language backgrounds, so you can use words you know they'll understand. For example, if I'm teaching Spanish students, I know they'll probably understand the word comprehensible because it's similar to the Spanish word comprensible. These words are called cognates, by the way. Another example of an English-Spanish cognate is nation and nación. But with a podcast, you can't use pictures or gestures. And I wanted the podcast to be useful for listeners around the world, so I didn't want to use the cognate method or translation. So I had two main ways to make myself comprehensible. I could explain the meanings of words and sometimes use sound to explain the meaning. That's why I decided to use 4 levels: beginner, pre-intermediate, intermediate, and advanced, to divide up the stories. Fortunately, there is a fantastic resource called English Profile, which tells you what words belong to what language level. They use data, information. They use data from English language exams around the world to decide which words were beginner words, which were intermediate words, and so on. They use the levels from the Common European Framework of Reference, or CEFR. You might have heard of the CEFR before. It has 6 levels: A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2. The beginner level episodes of English spoken stories are A2 level, the pre-intermediate episodes are B1, the intermediate episodes are B2, and the advanced stories are C1 level. I decided to not do A1 or C2 because A1 is very hard to teach without using translation, drawing pictures, and so on, and when you're at C2 level, you can usually start using resources that native speakers would use. For example, reading Harry Potter or watching the TV show Friends. Every time I write a new story, I decide what level it's going to be, and then I use the English Profile vocabulary lists to make sure that all the words in the story are at the same level or from a lower level. I also try to include around 10 new words, which I explain the meaning of at the start of the episode. These are always words from a higher level. So when I write a beginner-level story, I try to only use A2 and A1 level words. But maybe I want to use the word smile, which is a B1 level word. Then I will make sure to introduce smile earlier in the episode and explain its meaning. This is following Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis, I plus 1. Following the acquisition learning hypothesis, English spoken stories focuses on only providing comprehensible input. I almost never talk about grammar on here, and I teach words in context. The monitor hypothesis doesn't affect my podcast very much, as I can't stop you from using your monitor when you're speaking and writing. But my hope is that the easily comprehensible stories will help you relax over time and use your monitor less. Similarly, I try to make the stories as fun as possible so that you don't get an effective filter when learning English. Or, if you already do get very nervous about English, my fun, relaxed style will help with that. Many listeners have told me that they listen to the podcast before bed, or that they tell the stories to their children. This is fantastic. You're having so much fun. You've forgotten that you're supposed to be learning. Finally, following the natural order hypothesis, I don't worry about grammar levels. Instead, I try to make the lower-level stories less grammatically complicated. I do this by using shorter sentences and making more direct references. Let me give you an example. In an advanced story, I might say, George took off his hat and sat down at the table. There was lots of delicious food there, which was good, because he was hungry. In a beginner-level story, I would say, George took off his hat and sat down at the table. There was lots of delicious food on the table. That was good, because George was hungry. See how I said on the table instead of there, and George instead of he? This is less complicated, so it takes less time for our brain to understand. As you get more comprehensible input, you become more comfortable with the language, and your brain can understand it more quickly. That's why you can understand much more complicated sentences at higher levels. Traditional language teaching doesn't understand grammar in this way. Instead, teachers say that there are beginner-level grammar points and advanced grammar points. The passive construction is a grammar point that is usually considered advanced. An example of the passive construction is saying, the office was built instead of, they built the office. If you believe that language is abstract, then this doesn't make sense. And this idea of grammar levels is terrible for communication and telling stories. For example, some language teachers only teach the present tense for the first year of classes because they think the past tense is more advanced than the present tense. So for a whole year, you can only talk about things happening right now. You can't talk about anything that happened in the past. I don't know about you, but I can't tell stories that way. Sometimes I need those advanced grammar points in my beginner-level stories. And to enjoy a story, you only need to understand the meaning of what is happening. If you don't know all the little pieces of grammar yet, that's fine. You will acquire them later after seeing the grammar enough times. Okay, this is all sounding quite abstract, so let me give an example. I'm going to give you 3 sentences. They are all talking about a similar idea, but they start with simple grammar and go up to advanced grammar. However, I have changed one of the words to a made-up word, a word that is not real. See if you can understand. I blonkied the cake and she arrived. I had just blonkied the cake when she arrived. She's already here, but don't worry. The cake has been blonkied. Did you understand the meaning of the first sentence better than the third? Maybe a bit, but you're still not sure what blonky means. But if I say, I cleaned up the cake and she arrived, I had just cleaned up the cake when she arrived. She's already here, but don't worry. The cake has been cleaned up. Then you probably understood quite well. It doesn't matter that I used higher-level grammar in the second and third sentences. You probably understood those sentences a lot better than the Blanky ones. So that's why I focus on teaching words and not grammar points. Phew. So that's it. That's Stephen Krashen's theory of comprehensible input, and that's why I do the podcast the way I do. Well done for listening to all of this. You now understand language acquisition better than most people. You now understand language acquisition better than a lot of teachers. Now, when you want to improve your English or pick up another language, you can have more fun and acquire language much faster. And if you're a teacher, hopefully this has given you lots to think about. If you're thinking, time, this is all great, but where can I find good comprehensible resources for learning languages? I recommend you go to my channel English Spoken Stories and watch all of the videos. You will learn more and more. When you go to my channel, you get a free videos with my top 10 language learning advice, and I'll upload every time there's a new episode of the podcast. You can even watch and download from my channel English Spoken Stories. Really, I don't mind. Of course, you might also be thinking, but Jam, I love studying grammar. And that's fine. Do what you find fun and what you can keep doing for a long time. As long as you're still improving, that's all that matters. On the other hand, if this episode has sparked an interest in you, when something sparks an interest, you become very interested in something new. If this episode has sparked an interest for second language acquisition theory, then I recommend you listen to my episode Why You Must Read English, already uploaded, where I talk more about research into reading and language acquisition. You can listen to Why You Must Read at English Spoken Stories. There's even some of stories in there. I'm going to do another episode soon called How to Teach a Language, which will give advice for people who want to teach a language to a friend or partner. I know many people speak less commonly studied languages and have a partner who wants to learn it. Actually, I've been teaching Esperanto to my girlfriend, and I'm going to talk more about that in the episode How to Teach a Language and give lots of practical advice. Thanks very much for watching this lesson. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed this one. Share it too. And also subscribe if you have not already. Thanks very much for watching this video, and I will see you again soon. Bye.